Friends, the poem for today is titled A River by A.K. Ramanujan. Let me tell you something about the author quickly before we go on to the poem. A.K. Ramanujan or Attipat Krishnaswamy Ramanujan is a bilingual poet who wrote both in Kannada and in English. He is a very famous poet, translator, folklorist and critic. He is interested in linguistics and cultural studies. He, as I told you, he was bilingual, and he was, after his education in Mysore, and he worked in Pune for some time, and then he went over to the USA as a teacher of Dravidian studies and linguistics at the University of Chicago, and he spent a long spell of years, in almost 15 years or more, in America. And he is also known as an excellent translator of Kannada and Tamil literary texts into English. He was successful both, as a scholar and as a poet and as a critic, both in India and abroad. And so I guess we'll discuss. He was born in 1929 and he died in 1993. And let me now come to the poem and more features of the writer as a poet that we can deal with after we discuss the poem. So this poem, titled A River, was published in 1966 in his collection of poems called The Striders. Let me just read the poem to you first. This is how the poem goes. In Madurai, city of temples and poets who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars under the bridges with patches of repair all over them. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman, drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. He said, the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. So that is the poem, A River. And now let us look at it more carefully. So he begins saying, or telling us about the location. Which river is he talking about here? He says it is in Madurai, and the reference is to the river Vaigai that flows through Madurai. And Madurai, of course, is known as the city of temples and poets, and poets who sang of cities and temples. And he says that every summer this river dries up and it reveals the ugly underbelly of the river. And you see all sorts of things there, very undesirable scenes you see, things you see at the bottom of the dried river, on the riverbed. You see sand ribs, so the ribs or the bottom of the river is revealed. And you see the ribs of the river, because you have maybe lines or designs on the sand, and you have a lot of straw there, and women's hair clogging the water gates at rusty bars under the bridges. So again, the condition of the everything, there is a picture of degeneration everywhere. Rusty bars, bridges with patches of repair all over them. And then he talks about the wet stones, the stones which are under the river water, when this river dries up, all the stones are revealed, they can be seen, and some of them which are rough look like sleepy crocodiles, and the smooth ones, the dry ones, they look like shaven water buffaloes. And then he again says the poets only sang of the floods. So the stress is on that word only. And then he talks about somebody was there for a day. This person had visited Madurai during the floods, and he gives a report of what he saw there. And there was anxiety everywhere. People were talking about the river rising, and maybe there would have been announcements in the radio and on TV about the inches of how the river water has risen by 2 inches. So people everywhere were discussing this, and the precise number of cobble steps run over by the water. So in the bathing places or in the ghats where people go and take a bath in the river, so there are stone steps, and the steps are being covered by the water flooding. The flooded river is covering the steps. And then you hear reports about how 3 village houses somewhere down the river, they have been carried away by this flood, and a pregnant woman had fallen into the river, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual, because it's a usual practice to name cows either as Gopi if it is as Gopi and Brinda. And so this again he mentions. And then he goes on to say that new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. So then he says that the new poets don't bother to talk about the realities of the flood. And he said, now the next stanza, he said, now he is once again the same person who described the scenes of the flooded river, and he said the river has water enough to be poetic only once a year. And then it carries away in the first hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Brinda and Gopi, and the pregnant woman. So see what the poet is trying to tell us here. And now I guess we'll discuss the themes, and so then it would be a discussion of the various details of the poem too. So here you can see that this poem is a kind of an invective. It criticizes the lack of responsibility of the new writers, of how the new poets, or the young poets we can say, they refuse to take up the responsibility of dealing with real life situations. Instead, they follow the older poets and write about life in a very unrealistic, or they give a romantic hue to life. They talk about love, and they talk about the beauty of the river, the full river, the flooded river, but they never mention the dark side of life. Because in the flood, it's not just that the river looks beautiful, the river causes a lot of destruction too. So here in this poem, this is actually a satire on the aloofness and the detached attitude of the so-called poets and the intellectuals. And so when I read this poem, it reminds me of other poems that I've read. Like for instance, one familiar poem to all of you would be W.H. Auden's Muse de Beaux Arts. There you have this picture of Icarus, because that poem itself was prompted by when Auden went to a museum and he saw this painting of Icarus, a very famous painting of where Icarus falls into the sea. And what happens there? Icarus, you can see the 2 legs of Icarus sticking out of the water. But then everything else is going on. There is a man working in the farm, and there is a ship sailing by. Nobody is bothered about this tragedy that has occurred to this person, Icarus. Nobody is trying to save him. So that indifference of how life goes on, even if as long as something doesn't affect us personally, life goes on. We don't care about what happens to others. That is exactly what I guess Ramanujan is trying to say here. And I am also reminded of the poem called Kalahanti, where in that poem, there is this reference to this village called Kalahandi, which is the most poverty-stricken village in India, and where the people are suffering. It is below poverty line. If there is a line called the poverty line, it is below that. People don't have food. Fathers are forced to sell daughters to feed the family. People sell anything and everything valuable so that they can eat at least one meal a day. So that kind of a situation. What happens is that the officials, the officers and all that, to them Kalahandi matters. They just talk about Kalahandi. They hold seminars on how poverty can be removed. They show the statistical details of Kalahandi as a symbol of poverty and what happens to poor people. But nothing is done to improve the lot of these poor people. So that indifference of the general public and the bureaucracy and the intellectuals, the poets, the writers, to what is really happening in this world. So that is what we see in this poem. And again, he criticizes the poets for conforming to tradition and for their lack of originality and creativity, how they simply copy or imitate the themes that the earlier poets did. They don't realize that they live in a different world where the concerns are different, where the world which has changed, and so much is different from the earlier times, but they close their eyes towards that kind of reality. They prefer to keep themselves safe in the cocoon of romanticism. So A.K. Ramanujan loudly protests against this kind of an attitude. And you can see what a drab picture he gives us, because even when we read this poem, we are taken aback by the drabness of the picture, because we too are used to looking at rivers as something beautiful. The river has always been presented as a symbol of fertility, a symbol of creativity, something that brings a symbol of good fortune. So very different from that, you have this disturbing reality of a dry river and of women's hair and straw clogging clogging. That is what remains, and so all that, it is disturbingly realistic, and these are stark images which we generally like to avoid. That is exactly what Ramanujan is trying to tell us, because he feels that it is the responsibility of the poet, of the writer, to bring such things to the forefront, to make people think about what is going on around them, to wake them up from this very deliberate slumber into which they have steeped themselves. So in this poem, you can see that there is such a strong sentiment there and you can see how details are drawn with such accuracy, and you can see the roving eye of a perceptive and a very keen observer. And there is this critic S.C. Harrix who has said about Ramanujan's language. He says, A.K. Ramanujan used language with a surgeon-like precision, realizing that the secret of life is more likely to be found in the smallest rather than the most comic particles of existence. So I like that idea of Ramanujan's writing being, his language being something that is very sharp, very stark, with a surgeon-like precision. That's very true, because it cuts the reader's mind with the starkness, with the precise images that he pictures. And you can, when we talk about the general features of Ramanujan's poetry, one thing is that there is a fusion of the native culture with the detachment of a Westerner, because for many years he lived abroad, and so he gained a kind of a detachment, and so there is this fusion of his Indian and American experiences. Both have had their own impact on his writing, and there is this unique amalgamation of the traditional and the modern, and he has managed to maintain a balance between the two. It is very much rooted in the Indian, but he has got a transnational outlook too, and he looks at life in a very anti-sentimental manner. he has an anti-sentimental approach to life in general, and personal experiences in particular. And you don't find much of a tenderness in Ramanujan's poetry. He always voices a kind of aloof and a detached view of life. Now, another popular poem of Ramanujan is the poem Ecology, where you have this conflict between the mother and the son regarding a few champak trees in the compound, because the trees, every time they bloom, they create headache because his mother's got migraine, and as soon as the tree, as the flowers bloom, the strong scent, the fragrance of the flowers, it creates headache for the mother. And the son wants to cut down the trees, the mother says no. So there the mother is a representative of tradition, whereas this son who wants to cut down the trees is a representative of the modern generation. So he doesn't have any kind of tenderness towards the trees. He has grown up with those trees, but he doesn't have any soft feelings for the trees. Whereas the mother is too steeped in that kind of emotional, she's got a lot of emotional attachment to the tree. So we can see that conflict there. And here too, he says that this conformity to tradition, so here too he says that the conformity to tradition is good in certain respects, but then it is high time that we come out of that conformity and that we look at life in a more contemporary manner, to deal with the realities of today than in dwelling in the glories of the past. So this is what he talks about in this poem. And so you can see when he talks about this, this person who tells us or narrates the events to us, he says that the river has water enough to be poetic only about once a year. So he is again making fun of the attitude of the poets. So once a year when the river floods, it becomes very poetic, but other times the river is dry and drab. And again, maybe it reminds us also of the way that the rivers are drying up, and of the calamities that human beings are causing to nature, of how a lot of pollutants are being opened and let out into the river. The purity of the river is lost. So many such issues. It's a poem with a lot of layers of meanings, and it can be interpreted in multifarious ways. So that is, I guess, and again this this mother, this pregnant woman who is drowned, that again reminds one of this, this it gives an opposite picture of the river as a symbol of fertility, because here the river is a symbol of death. It is a symbol of destruction. When you say that a pregnant woman and her 2 children are the twins, it might be twins, who knows, it might be twins. So then here, instead of being a life giver, the river is being a life taker. Instead of giving life, it causes death. So that is what is significant about the picture of the pregnant woman. And again, village houses, and then the indifference with which the people speak about the flood. As long as their houses are safe, as long as their relatives and their people are safe, it doesn't matter to them who drowns or whose villages. And here there's a special mention of 3 village houses. So the houses in Madurai are all safe, but these villages, maybe these are villages somewhere down the river from where Vaigai has been flowing, and so she has taken the rivers from the houses from there. So Madurai is safe. So the people of Madurai are indifferent. Just like the man in the poem, in the painting of Icarus, who doesn't bother about what is happening to Icarus. As long as he is safe, all is fine with him. So that kind of carelessness and indifference is one prominent theme in this poem. And of course, you can read more into the poem, more meanings into the poem. And as I said, it is a poem with a lot of layers of meaning. So I would invite you to read the poem and kind of uncover the various, or unravel the various hidden layers of meaning in the poem.